this is another going to be an incredible Outlier Project Conversations with Legends series, and I could not be more excited to have Colin here. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started really quick. So our book for September is Christine Lilly's book, Powerhouse. If you want a signed copy, just let Kathy know, put it in the chat, and Christine will sign a copy of her book, Powerhouse, for you guys. But for those of you who don't know, soccer Hall of Famer, two-time World Cup champ, two-time Olympic gold medalist. So she's going to be joining us October 4th, but we're reading her book now. Then following that, we're reading Iman Obu's book, The Glass Ledge. Iman is a former microbiologist, turned Miss New York, turned CEO of Sway Media, and her book has already been a bestseller. And then a mutual friend of Colin and I, our book for November is Mark Champagne's Personal Socrates. If you did not hear Colin on Mark's podcast, Behind the Human, check it out. It's really, really good. And then our Conversations with Legends series. So on the 20th, Chris Schembra, who wrote Gratitude and Pasta, and he also wrote the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Gratitude Through Hard Times, which just came out. He's going to be joining us. He's a founder of the Rolling Stone Culture Council and just an absolutely cool guy. We follow that up with Joe Foster, who's an absolute legend. He's the founder of Reebok. He's 86 years old, I think, but just the coolest guy. Joe's joining us on October 11th. And then we have John Barrows, who's the CEO of Sell Better, just a mere 400,000 followers on LinkedIn, and he trains Google and LinkedIn and Salesforce, etc. So for those of you, if you've never been on one of these calls before, we do typically like a 30-minute interview and then 30 minutes of live Q&A. If you have a question for Colin, just drop it in the chat. You don't have to put what your question is. Kathy will tee you up, and then I'll introduce you to Colin, and you can ask your question directly to him. So without further ado, let me introduce you. Today we've got Colin O'Brady, a good friend of mine and an absolute legend. So 10 world records. I think a lot of people know about the Antarctica expedition. The one that blows my mind, and I posted about this the other day, is one that I think, Colin, you get very little recognition for. It's the 50 summits. So the 50 summits, let me just explain what this is for you guys. So it's climbing to the highest peak in every state. You go, that sounds pretty challenging. So there's only, I think, been a few hundred people that have ever done it in their lifetime. So the world record was 41 days. And to put that in perspective, the average person climbs Denali, one mountain, in 18 days. And Colin, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this info.
That's right.
So the record was 21 days to climb 50 mountains in 50 states, which logistically, like, just try to figure out how to even get to 50 states that quickly. Colin broke the record not by 20 seconds, not by 20 minutes, not by 20 hours. He broke the record by 20 days. So Colin climbed the 50 highest mountains in the US, including Denali, in 21 days. Most people, it takes them 18 days to climb Denali, period. So anyway, he's a freak of nature. We'll talk a little bit about some of the other world records that he owns, but he's the New York Times best-selling author of The Impossible First. This book, I think, a one sign of a great book. I know Colin's story pretty well. He's got an incredible wife, Jenna. I know their whole backstory. I could not, even though I knew the story, I could not put the book down. Same for my wife, Meg, who's on the call. Just an unbelievable book. He's a TV host of a series called The Survivalists. He is an unbelievable keynote speaker. He's got a keynote speech today in Austin, Texas. He's been on Good Morning America. He's been on Joe Rogan twice. You've seen him maybe on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. He's a Yale grad. His TED Talk, I think, has got like 2.9 million views. And he's the author of this book behind me, The 12-Hour Walk, which we're going to get into. And he is probably, I don't know if he's best known for this, but certainly got a ton of publicity when he went solo, unaided and unsupported, pulling a 300-pound sled across Antarctica. So that is a little bit about Colin O'Brady. So Kathy, let's get us started.
Lightning inside me, son of a god. I'm like a titan that's rising on just your watch. I'm stepping into fate. There is no time to waste. I've got that lightning inside me. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Colin, my friend, thank you for joining us. I am unbelievably excited for people to get to know you and to hear your stories. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. It was quite an introduction. Love it.
You know, we don't mess around, Colin. You know that. You know that. So normally I interview people for about a half an hour and I ask them, you know, a whole bunch of questions, but I think we're going to switch it up a little bit. And we've never done this, I don't think, in the 2 years of interviewing everybody under the sun. I think I've only got about one question for Colin because his story is so remarkable and the arc of his story is just incredible. And I think you've accomplished so much, Colin, that it's almost people are forgetting kind of what happened in Thailand and some of the other things that kind of brought you to this moment where you just put out another bestseller in the 12-Hour Walk, which I thought when you and I talked about it, I thought it was one of the most brilliant concepts I've ever heard in my life. So I really have one question for you, and it's not really a question, it's really a request, is take us through that journey, if you can, in 30 minutes or so, that led you all the way to this point of writing your second bestseller, The 12-Hour Walk, which I think is off the charts good.
Yeah, that's I'll do my best. Some twists and turns in the story, but it's great to be here with everyone. I guess you mentioned Thailand, so I think perhaps that's a appropriate place to start. So I grew up in Portland, Oregon. Didn't have a lot of money when I was a kid growing up. Always just kind of dreamed about seeing a little bit more of the world. I was introduced to the outdoors because my dad was an Eagle Scout, and again, didn't have a lot of money, but he's like, the outdoors are free. So, you know, it took me hiking, backpacking, walking around the Pacific Northwest was most of my childhood. But when I was 16, I started painting houses every summer so that I could save up. Like one day when I graduate from college, I want to take a trip around the world and just like see the world a little bit. So I was a swimmer growing up, ended up getting recruited to swim at Yale. And when I graduated, instead of taking an investment banking job or all the real jobs that all my peers were taking, I said, I'm going to take $10,000, all my full life savings, and take a backpack and a surfboard and try to travel around the world for a year by myself. which was an amazing experience for sure. On the first stop of that trip, I had a free layover in Fiji, of all places, and I ended up meeting my now wife of 15 years. So I think I won right out of the gates there on that one. I was 22 years old. She was 20. And we've had a long and meandering, beautiful love story ever since. But went to Fiji, hitchhiked through New Zealand for a couple months, surfed in Australia. Like I said, just shoestring budget. I was sleeping on floors in youth hostels, a few dollars in my pocket for beers at night, just trying to be a young person out in the world and spread my wings. An amazing experience, all until I found myself on this small beach in rural Thailand. And being 22 years old, I didn't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex, I suppose. So I looked over and saw a couple guys jumping a flaming jump rope. And I thought, gee, that looks like fun. And so I jumped this flaming jump rope, and in an instant, my life changed. That rope wrapped around my legs and lit my body completely on fire to my neck. Sort of survival mode kicked in, thankfully, when I needed it most. And I jumped into the ocean to extinguish the flames, but not before about 25% of my body was severely burned, predominantly my legs and feet. And I was in the middle of nowhere in Thailand. I had a moped ride down a dirt path to a one-room nursing station, basically. No proper medical facilities. I underwent 8 surgeries in rural Thailand. Was way too unstable to be moved. And one of the things that was the hardest part was the doctor walked in one day and he said to me, Colin, I hate to tell you this, but you will probably never walk again normally. And it was because how badly the ligaments and ankle joints and knee joints were burned. They didn't think that I would ever regain full mobility of my legs. And I think that's a devastating diagnosis for any person at any phase of their life, but certainly as a young person, certainly someone who I'd really kind of identified as an athlete, very much in my body at this phase of my life, was just devastating. So it certainly enveloped the physical pain. The emotional pain of that was just so deep. And I went into a deep, dark downward spiral. Thankfully, there is a heroine to this story, which is my mother. She arrived around like day 5, found me in the middle of nowhere in rural Thailand. And I know now as a parent what it must be like to see your kid in this helpless state on the other side of the world. And she told me now that she was crying in the hallways, pleading with the doctors for some semblance of good news. But she really never showed me her fear. Instead, she came into my hospital room every single day with this huge smile on her face and this air of positivity, daring me to dream about the future. And she would, say things to me like, Colin, your life isn't over. What do you want to do when you get out of here? Let's set a goal. Let's look towards the future. And I was kind of like, what do you, Mom, like, don't try to cheer me up. Like, this is a horrible situation. But one day she was like, just do me a favor. Let's do a visualization. Close your eyes and picture where you want to be after this. And so I played along that day, closed my eyes, and she saw me smiling with my eyes closed. She says, what do you see? And I said, oh, it's going to sound ridiculous. I don't even want to tell you. And she said, well, tell me. I said, well, I see myself crossing the finish line of a triathlon. And she's like, great. Then that's your goal. And she could have very easily been like, yeah, I said set a goal, but look at your legs, like triathlon, probably not in the cards for you. She says, great. In fact, you should start training right now. And she yells over to the Thai doctor and she says, Doc, my son's training for a triathlon now. Bring him in some weight. So I actually have this photograph of me bandaged from the waist down in the middle of nowhere in Thailand, lifting 10-pound dumbbells with this Thai doctor looking over at me like, someone better slap some sense in this stupid American kid. Like, he's never going to walk again. But it was fixed in my mind. Many months that I was in that Thai hospital, when I was flown back to Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, to my mom's house, I was carried on and off the plane. I was in a wheelchair when I got home. And through the next period of time, I literally learned how to take my first step, my next step after that, and eventually could walk around my block, and finally wanted to get out of my parents' basement. So I moved to Chicago, took a job in finance in Chicago, 2008, great year to start your career in finance. I started that and signed up for the Chicago Triathlon to honor this goal. And 18 months after being burned in this fire, 18 months after being told I would never walk again normally, I decided, and I signed up, like I said, and I raced the Chicago Triathlon. It was an amazing day for me, swimming, biking, running, crossing that finish line. I had done it. I had proven these doctors wrong, and more than anything, proven to myself that I could, be able-bodied and whole again in that way. And to my complete and utter surprise, I didn't just finish the race, which was my goal, but I actually won the entire Chicago Triathlon, placing first out of about 5,000 other participants on the day. which was a complete and utter surprise for sure. Now, in that moment, you know, some people hear that story and they think like, oh, well, you must have just thought, well, I guess you're a superhuman athlete. You can do anything, like amazing, like the great moral of the story. And like, for me, that's very, very far away from the actual point. That's not where my mind was at all. My mind immediately went back to that Thai hospital, wondering what would have happened had my mom not looked towards the future and forced me to set this measurable goal. In my new book, The 12-Hour Walk, I talk about this concept. I didn't call it this then, but it certainly is the same thing. I talk about this concept that I call a possible mindset. And I define that as a possible mindset is an empowered way of thinking that unlocks a life of limitless possibilities. It's a way of framing the world into what's possible, what are the limitless possibilities that lie in front of me, even in the face of adversity, even in the face of challenges, even in the face of setbacks. And so my mother, you know, through this deep, deep tragedy in my life and the eventual, I guess, winning of this triathlon, proved to me not just this one-off circumstance, but it proved to me an entire way of seeing and perceiving the world that completely shifted my outlook. And I fundamentally believe, not just myself, but all of us, I believe we all have reservoirs of untapped potential to achieve extraordinary things. And so with this sort of new possible mindset, with this new curiosity for life, new curiosity for what is possible, I did the most obvious thing that any 23-year-old kid with a promising financial career would do is I walked in on Monday and I quit my job. And I became a professional triathlete, which is not like professional football or baseball or somewhere where you get drafted and there's some big salary. It's back to sleeping on couches and eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and trying to figure out how to make it work. But I had this new sort of on-ramp to cultivate my passion for pushing my body and learning more about the potential that wrote inside me. And so for the next 6 or 7 years, I raced triathlon professionally for the US national team all over the world, 25 countries, 6 different continents, an incredible experience in my 20s to have that. And then on the fall of 2014, I found myself with a diamond ring in my pocket on the summit of Ecuador's third tallest mountain at 19,000 feet, proposing to my longtime girlfriend, Jenna, asking her to marry me. And it was a beautiful moment. And we really cultivated that same possible mindset in that moment of like, great, we're getting married. We're thinking about the future, our future together, a lifetime together. What do we want our life to be like? What do we want to dream up? What do we want to dream into reality? And so we had this brainstorm on the top of this mountain, 2 naive, young, in love kids, basically. And we said, you know, I said, I still want to push my body in unique and interesting ways. I said, in fact, one of my biggest goals has been to climb Mount Everest since I was a little kid. I always wanted to climb Mount Everest. I was like, is there any way I could possibly do that? We got to talking more. And both of us also said, you know, we want to have deep impact, whatever we do in our life. We want to have impact beyond ourselves, not just our own sort of, successes and failures, but to have a ripple effect of positivity in our community. So I said, maybe we should start a nonprofit or something like that. In the midst of this brainstorm, we just brainstormed this idea to see if I could set a world record for something called the Explorers Grand Slam. So that was to climb not just Everest, but the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents, as well as complete expeditions to both the North Pole and the South Pole. And in that, we said, maybe if we do that at a great enough scale, we could, kind of harness PR and media and inspire a lot of people and start this nonprofit around kids, reaching their summit of their own Everest, their own hopes, their own dreams, not about climbing, but about health and wellness and well-being and achievement, goal setting, et cetera. And then we get back to our 1-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon. And this is an important point in the story because this is the moment where most dreams go to die. You're like excited, you're lit up, you've got this big idea, and then like reality hits. I'm sitting in a 1-bedroom apartment. We have no money. I've never climbed really any mountains before. We have no idea how to start a nonprofit. And it's easy to wake up that morning and be like, yeah, that was super fun. And we were getting engaged on this mountaintop and we dreamed this massive dream. But like, come on, how are we ever going to do this? Climbing those mountains is going to cost $500,000. We don't know anything about starting a nonprofit. We don't have a network. We don't have all the things that you don't have, right? We all know this feeling. It's like you drinking beers with a buddy on a Saturday night. And you're like, yo, we're going to run that marathon next year. And we're going to train and we're going to do this, whatever. And you wake up hungover the next day and you're like, call your buddy. You're like, yeah, man, I'm out. Like, I'm not, I'm just bullshitting with you. Because our minds are so powerful in one way or the other, right? And we all know this feeling of limiting beliefs, of being held back. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I'm not strong enough. I don't like being uncomfortable. What if I fail? What if people criticize me? Those questions, those limiting beliefs, create the structure for the 12-Hour Walk, my new book, which I'll tell you a little bit more about as it intersects with the story I'm sharing with you guys. But in that moment of Jenna and I dreaming up this big dream, our Everest, literally me, my childhood dream wanting to climb up Everest, all of those doubts, all of those fears crept in. But we decided to push those aside and instead lean into the possible mindset, lean into the idea of abundance, lean into, if we believe in this enough and are willing to go after our dream every single day, we have no idea how we're going to figure this out, but we're going to keep chipping away. We're going to keep finding a way. And I give a whole other 30-minute speech on what those next 18 months were. And I won't bore you with the details, but the long story short is we had no money, no resources, no background, nothing. And we tried to convince thousands of people to help us. And the first 1,000 people we asked for money, support, sponsorship, guidance, mentorship, all slammed the door in our face and said, no, 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 you don't have enough experience. You don't have enough background. You're like, why would we bet on you, etc. But through continuing to knock on doors, continuing to believe in our dreams, we finally created enough momentum and energy, raised the money we needed, started the nonprofit, and I departed to climb these mountains. And in 2016, in 139 consecutive days, I climbed all the 7 summits, Everest, Denali, Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, etc., as well as completed expeditions in the North and South Pole, and set my first 2 world records, both the Explorers Grand Slam and the 7 summits. And it was a beautiful moment for both of us. Everything that I've done, Jen and I have been together for 15 years. And so sometimes my name is next to the world record or things like that, but really it's been co-created by both of us and dreamed into reality by both of us. And Scott and Meg know Jenna really well also. And she's just a great blessing in my life. But what was so beautiful about completing that project and that expedition was one of the things we started asking. So we started this nonprofit, and at this point we've had about 1 million students enrolled in our programs in various capacities over the years. And at that time, when I was actually climbing Mount Everest, this is before COVID and digital school, but we were doing digital programs and digital curriculums because I was out in the world and interacting with students. And Jenna started asking students this one question. She started asking them, Colin's climbing Mount Everest right now, but what's your Mount Everest? What's your Everest? And it's amazing when you ask students this question. I've now asked this question to so many people. We've predominantly done work with elementary school kids. So after the success of this world record, we were starting to get some momentum, and we started traveling around visiting schools all over the country in person. And I'd be in gymnasiums full of 500 students, elementary school kids, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds. And I would ask that question. I'd say, well, what is your Everest? And what was amazing is that 500 hands would shoot up in the air. Every single kid had an answer to this question. Not only did they have an answer to this question, but they wanted to share it in front of their peers, say it out loud, own it. My Mount Everest to be the first person in my family to graduate from college. Or my Mount Everest is to make sure the snow leopards are off the endangered species list one day, or whatever. I've heard thousands of responses to this. Now, I loved that, and I loved doing that work. But what happened is I started speaking to high school kids and then college kids and speaking in a corporate environment. And as every age bracket bracketed up, what I found is that there was fewer and fewer and fewer hands raised. As I get to a corporate speech in middle America, I'm lucky if, I've got 2 hands up at the back of the room with 1,000 people in it. And so it got me to thinking, I was like, what's happening here? What's happening here? And this possible mindset, this concept that I talked to you about, the concept that's foundational to my newest book, I realized that in this book, I'm not teaching people a new concept. We are born with possible mindsets. We actually come into this world believing in limitless possibilities, but unfortunately, our society, our culture, the stresses, the challenges of life over time create limits, box us in. And so rather than teaching the new concept of a possible mindset, I'm actually just reteaching you something that you already know, something that you were foundationally born with. And that what's your Everest question, although it was an amazing question to ask so many people, This was in 2016, 2017. I was in my early 30s at that point. And I thought, well, I've climbed Mount Everest. And I'm asking all these people, what's your Everest? But I need to ask myself that question again. I realize it's an important question for all of us to ask at many phases of our life. Every single person on this call, every single person in anybody's talk I'm giving. But in this moment in time, I realized, Colin, you need to ask yourself this question. Just because you've actually climbed Mount Everest doesn't mean I'm just going to kick my feet up for the rest of my life and do nothing. What was my next Everest? What is my next hope? What is my next dream? And so in 2018, I set my sights on not just a world record, but a world first, something that no one in history had ever accomplished before, which was the world's first solo, unsupported, fully human-powered crossing of the continent of Antarctica. So that's a 1,000-mile journey from one coast to the other coast via the South Pole. Average temperature is about -40 degrees, completely alone, but unsupported means no resupplies of food or fuel along the way, which means you actually have to carry everything with you, or in my case, drag a sled, which ultimately weighed 375 pounds with all the food and all the fuel that I needed. Now, this is not something that I came up with out of nowhere. People have been attempting this crossing for about 100 years, and no one had successfully accomplished it. People had died trying. People had run out of food and had to be emergency evacuated from the continent. And people started to say, it's actually impossible. The math equation doesn't work. To have enough food and supplies to get across the continent of Antarctica, you'd have to drag 1,000 pounds, and no one can move 1,000 pounds on the first day. So it just doesn't work. There's a lot written about how impossible this project was. And Jenna and I thought, you know what? It might actually be impossible. But that's not a reason not to try it. That's not a reason not to try it. And so we named our first, this project, this Antarctica project, we'll have to name our projects. We named this one The Impossible First. Literally saying this might be impossible, but by aiming so high, we've all heard it, shoot for the moon, for if you miss, you land amongst the stars. We figured by trying to hack and trying to create something that we had never done before, we'd either succeed against all odds, or we'd fail, but learn so much. And is that really a failure? I don't think so. I think you either succeed or you learn. Right? You learn all of these things about yourself, about your strength, about all the different layers that we had to learn about to attempt this project. So in 2018, excuse me, in 2018, I set off to attempt this solo crossing of Antarctica. And I was getting ready to depart, and we'd rallied some great press and media to cover it. The New York Times did a big interview with me and announcing, this Colin O'Brady is going to attempt to be this first person to make this crossing. We don't know if he's going to make it or not. And right as I'm getting ready to announce, right as I'm getting ready to fly down to Antarctica, a British explorer on the other side of the world basically took the exact same interview that I did, but with the London Herald. And he announced, I'm going to attempt to be the first person in history to cross Antarctica solo, unsupported, and unassisted. And both him and I had been training and planning and plotting to do this crossing unbeknownst to each other. But we announced our project on the exact same day on the other sides of the world, because there's only one season that you can cross Antarctica. And we both obviously knew that. And there's also only one guy with one plane that can drop you off on the edge of Antarctica in this season. So we both called the exact same guy, and this was no longer a race against history. But I found myself a few days later sitting shoulder to shoulder in a cargo plane on the edge of Antarctica, being flown shoulder to shoulder, looking into the eyes of Captain Lou Rudd, a British Special Forces military badass, also one of the most accomplished polar explorers in the world, looking over in my eyes going, what are you doing here? The British have a long history of polar exploration, the Americans not so much. And he goes, it should be a Brit who cracks this journey first. So I no longer am racing history, but I'm shoulder to shoulder racing a guy 1,000 miles, one-on-one, mano-a-mano across the most desolate, inhospitable place on the entire planet. And we get dropped off on the frozen continent. We make a gentleman's agreement to get dropped off maybe 1 mile apart from each other, just so we weren't standing right next to each other to start a 1,000-mile race dragging a 375-pound sled. And we get dropped off. I actually get dropped off first, and the plane doesn't even take off. It just drives across the ice. And about 5 minutes later, he hops out of the plane, and we wave at each other to begin this 1,000-mile race. And I start pulling my sled to begin this race. And I can only pull it for about 10 steps at a time. I pull with all my might, 375 pounds, and I can't. And I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? Is something wrong with my body? Another 10 steps, and I stop, and I completely fail. And I realize that I'm ill-prepared or not strong enough or not ready. Now, like I said, I thought I might fail with this project, but I thought I might fail on the 30th day or the 40th day. I'm 1 hour in, and I'm sobbing, crying. But what happens when it's minus 40 degrees outside and you start crying? It turns out the tears, they actually freeze to your face, which is like the all-time most pathetic, worst feeling you're ever going to feel ever. And so I think to myself, well, Captain Lou must be struggling too. Misery loves company. And so I look over to my right where he was off in the distance. And instead of seeing a man struggling, I see a full military man in full march, disappearing across the horizon. He's not struggling at all. Now, I call my wife on the satellite phone and I say to her, Jenna, I think we named our project the right thing. This is indeed impossible. She's like, what are you talking about? You've been out there for an hour. And I explained the whole situation to her. And she says, do me a favor, Colin. Forget about Lou. Forget about the race. Forget about the 1,000 miles. Forget about all the pressure from the media. Just get to your first waypoint. Get to one incremental waypoint. It's a half a mile away. Set up your tent, and maybe tomorrow you'll be able to regroup, reset your mind. And so I said, you're right. I struggle to drag my sled a half a mile. I finally set up my tent on the ice for the first night. I wake up that next morning, and who's in the tent with me? Not Captain Lou. He didn't come back for me. I'm in there by myself, but I'm in there and I feel like I'm packed in there with the 5 other worst versions of myself. I wake up that morning and it's all my worst version. Colin, you're an idiot. You failed. You're not strong enough. You suck. Everyone's going to make fun of you. You failed on the first day. Like, this is so embarrassing. This is me in there. But I think we can all relate to that feeling, right? Like when we're just in our own heads being so hard on ourselves. And Jenna reminded me, she's like, why are you being so hard on yourself? You are in Antarctica. You know how many people sit around and say, one day I'm going to do this thing. One day I'm going to try this thing. You're actually there. You're doing it. You're trying it. Fail or succeed, you are there. Why are you being so hard on yourself? So I'm a big believer in this concept that we are the stories that we tell ourselves. We are the stories that we tell ourselves. And so I got up that day outside of my tent and I yelled as loud as I could to try to cut through the noise in my own head. I said, Colin, you are strong. You are capable. You are strong. You are capable. And it's not like that changed everything for me, but it gave me enough courage, enough strength to get out of my tent, to push one more day and a day after that and a day after that. And I want to fast forward through a bunch of stuff here as we're mostly want to take your questions and out of time, but on the 6th day, I did catch up to Captain Lou. And on that day, there's a whole story that unfolds between the two of us. But I realized that 10 hours was my normal day and I wasn't going to be enough. And so I pulled 12 hours that one day just to get a tiny little lead on Captain Lou. But that was only 6 days in. And quickly after that, Jenna told me, you're going to run out of food. You're going to run out of fuel. You're never going to stay in front of Lou. 12 hours has to be your actually normal day going forward. And so for the next 48 days alone in Antarctica, I pulled my sled 12 hours every single day with about 5 hours of chores on either side, setting up my tent, taking down my tent, melting snow, turning it into water, but 12 hours of pulling a sled every single day. And surprisingly, what happened is I didn't have nearly enough food. I lost about 40 or 50 pounds by the end. I was a bag of bones. My body was completely deteriorated. I had frostbite on my face and on my cheeks, completely beat up. Being in minus 40 degrees, minus 70 wind chill on most days. But as my body got weaker, my mind got stronger. I tapped into these places in my mind of these deep flow states of strength and possibility. I got stronger and stronger emotionally as the days went by, even though my body was withering away. So much so that on the final stretch, I actually pulled my sled 77 miles, 33 hours nonstop to complete this crossing on my last day of food on day 54, being alone in Antarctica. And what I found within myself, this inner strength, this inner sort of possibility inside of my mind, this connection to family, this connection to purpose, this deep flow state of energetic positivity, I came back and I thought, I'm going to take this with me forever. These 12-hour days of walking opened this thing inside of me that was so beautiful. And for the next several years, that was true. I had this strength inside my mind and body, this confidence, and I set some other world records. I was the first person in history to row a boat across Drake Passage. So I took a 28-foot rowboat and rowed it from the southern tip of South America to Antarctica, 40-foot swells, icebergs in the middle of nowhere, just rowing around this tiny little boat. Did some other things over those years. But then, as many of us found in the fall or the spring of 2020, I found myself locked down in COVID, just like the rest of us. I had just released my book, The Impossible First, become a New York Times bestseller. My book tour is canceled. I had a big expedition to Nepal planned with my wife. That was canceled. And I don't try to pretend that my book tour or my expeditions being canceled is the least of the world's worries, right? So many more bigger issues happening. But I got caught up in that news cycle. I was locked down in my house with my wife on the Oregon coast, reading the news, worried about my family. People are dying. Borders are closing. We can't go anywhere. Like, don't leave your house. And although I had found that deep meditative flow state in Antarctica alone in the stillness and the silence of that, I was not impervious to deep depression, anxiety, fear. I think we all remember pieces of that moment in time that we all collectively lived together. And at one point, my wife looks over at me. We're on the Oregon coast, and she says to me, you know, Colin, you haven't changed out of your pajamas in the last 4 days. And you've pretty much just been planted there on the couch, just like doom scrolling the news and like, oh my God, did you hear the borders closing here? Oh, people are dying in Italy. Like just like full of anxiety. She says, you don't seem like you're doing very well. And I said, I'm not. And so I thought back, when was the last time that I felt completely clear and free and at peace within my own mind, body, and spirit? And I said, well, it was actually when I was pulling that sled 12 hours a day. So I said to my wife, grasping at straws at this point for my own mental health, I said, you know, I'm going to do something tomorrow. I'm going to leave all day. I'm going to go for a walk, 12 hours, just out our front door here on the Oregon coast. And she just kind of shrugs her shoulders. She sees me do all sorts of crazy random stuff. And she's like, yeah, great, have fun. And so I wake up that next morning, I walk out my front door on the Oregon coast. About 20 minutes into this walk out my front door, my phone buzzes in my pocket. A friend of mine, he's texting me. And I pull up my phone. I'm about to text him back. And I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I need to be like texting my friend in the middle of this walk. Like, I'm trying to like reset my mental health here. And so I put my phone instinctively on airplane mode. And for the next 12 hours, I walk. No music, no podcast, just me alone in my thoughts. I take breaks, I stop, I rest. But I stay alone in my thoughts and my silence and the stillness for 12 hours. And when I get back to my front door, I walk in my front door, my dog jumps up on my lap. My wife sees me. I told her, I'm going to be back by dinner. And she goes, oh, you're back. And I said, yeah, I told you I'd be back in about 12 hours or so. I'm back. And she goes, no. You're back. You're back. Your essence is back. She could see it in me. This shift, this reset, this stillness, this silence, the simplicity of this moment opened up what I needed to get my own self back. And she was right. But I didn't think anything of it beyond just like, I'm great that I had my own personal breakthrough in this moment. I thought, gee, I'm the guy who walked across Antarctica in stillness and silence. I should say I deleted all my music and podcasts while I was walking across Antarctica too. So I spent those 54 days in complete silence. And I thought, oh, it's just a me thing. This is like what I did. But during the course of COVID, all sorts of friends and family members and colleagues and different people were also struggling. We're also going through hard times. And so I just casually brought this up to a handful of people at first. Well, I did this walk. I took a day by myself, walked out my front door, and it really changed my whole perspective. And before I knew it, all sorts of different people in my life, friend, family member, and then friends of friends, and people would tell each other about it, started taking this 12-hour walk themselves. And it wasn't just athletes. This wasn't just like super fit, ambitiously physical people. My 77-year-old mother-in-law did the 12-hour walk. And for her, it looked like walking one time around her block in North Carolina, sitting on her front porch in stillness and silence, and then walking another time. She maybe completed a mile in all of 12 hours. My badass ultra marathon friend did 50 miles on his 12-hour walk. But neither my mother-in-law nor him are doing the 12-hour walk better than the other person. It doesn't matter how far you go. I don't care if you go for 1 mile or 50 miles. It's about engaging with yourself. It's about taking a day, which is outside of our comfort zone typically, to be in stillness, to be in silence, to be in the solitude of your own thoughts, right out your front door. Doesn't matter if you live in a bustling city like New York, you're still committing to the silence of that, of that day. And the one thing that all these people have in common, even though they're all sorts of different people, young, old, different, sort of life circumstances, etc., is that every single person that I have ever known to take the 12-hour walk has come back completely shifted, letting go of many of those limiting beliefs that I mentioned before and embracing that possible mindset. So my new book, The 12-Hour Walk, is written from the perspective of it's edge of your seat storytelling. It's fun. It gets you excited. There's all sorts of things about it. But at its core, it invites you, the reader, it invites you to take a 12-hour walk of your own. And my next Everest is to inspire 10 million people to take the 12-hour walk. The book's only been out for a month, and I've already had thousands and thousands of people do it. Just this last Saturday, we had 2,000 people around the world doing the 12-hour walk in every single time zone of the world, in every single continent. No one's done it in Antarctica yet, although I guess I have many times, but every continent where most people live. And it's free. It's accessible for anyone. It meets you right where you're at. But in just one day, I've seen it have over-indexing, life-changing benefits. And so that's my story to now. To answer your one question, Scott, I hope I answered it correctly. Yeah.
Phenomenal. So I know that, as a community called the Outlier Project, I mean, we're always looking to do things outside of the box. And that's why it's so exciting to bring people on like yourself who live a life like that. And I think what you've done for all of us is given us something that's incredibly accessible, that any of us can do and that we all will do as a community. So there's 500 of us in 29 countries. And a lot of people will watch this on a replay. It's going to be inspiring to see our community all do that 12-hour walk and see what we get out of it, because I know that we're going to get a ton out of it. And I know that just our friendship alone has, enhanced my life tremendously. So I'm excited to share that with our whole community. So I know we don't have a ton of time left. I know Colin's under the weather. He's got a keynote speech today. We've got a couple people that I want to get on real quickly to ask a question. First, Mayan Gordon, we're going to go to you. You are up with the legendary Colin O'Brady.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible story. And I'm sure that that's, a small, tiny fraction of the many endless stories that make up kind of that timeline. I'm curious, this is a short 2-part question, but have you ever set a Mount Everest goal and then partway through the goal determined that it was not challenging enough and lost some amount of interest? And if so, what did you do? But then also, do you have like a process once you've accomplished a Mount Everest goal for figuring out what the next one's going to be?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I guess I haven't approached it from the same standpoint of, I didn't set a high enough bar for myself. I guess my affliction is maybe sometimes I just, set the most ridiculous bar for myself. But I will say, it's easy, Scott's very kind, long introduction of my accolades or accomplishments or things like that to be like, oh, wow, this guy has 10 world records. He's done this, he's done that, like all these sorts of things. And I write about this in 12-Hour Walk. One of the chapters is all about failure. That this limiting belief is, I'm afraid to fail. And I have failed over and over and over and over again. Like I just shared you a couple of stories about like where it like worked out and I achieved the thing or whatever. But I've been on the back of many, many times where I have set goals and not achieved them, right? Not quite gotten there. I spent 25 years of my life trying to make the Olympics in 2 different sports and fell short in both. So multiple decades of my life's energy put towards something that I didn't quite achieve. I love to say, though, I think winners lose the most, meaning trying things, learning from them, evolving into them, I think really is a part of the process. So in terms of the question about what's my sort of frame on that, sometimes it just comes to me and I actually, there's a part in the 12-hour walk where I invite people to answer that question, what's your Everest? But then I caveat that and say, but there is a subset of people, a larger subset of people that go, but what if I don't know what my Everest is right in this moment? And I say, well, then use the 12-hour walk as an invitation to ask yourself that question. Quiet the noise in your mind, put your phone on airplane mode, take a day and actually be the purpose of the walk be my Mount Everest for this walk is to discover what my Mount Everest is. Because I fundamentally believe, and I write also in this book all about intuition and gut, that the big answers in our life, we actually know the answer already. It lives inside of us. We so often look externally for, oh, but what about this or this pros and cons? I have this big decision in my life. I need to make all these pros and all these cons and all this and go through it and ask a million people, whatever. And sometimes that's valuable. But I fundamentally believe that more often than not, we actually already know the answer to the big questions in our life. We just don't give ourselves enough time or freedom or trust and faith in ourselves to have that be the answer in the 12-hour walk. And I've seen this with so many people having completed the walk. So many people come back and been like, oh, I've been like pondering this question, but I only do it 10 minutes at a time. And then I get distracted and whatever. And then people really dive into the question around their Everest or their purpose or a goal in their life. And they find deep clarity by giving themselves the time and freedom to explore it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Love it. Isabel in the UK, you are up.
Scott, thank you so much. And as ever, thank you so much for this. Colin, amazing. Wow. My God, I don't know what to say really, other than I've met Martin Hewitt, who has climbed with Louis. And I had the real privilege of doing a couple of jobs with him, and they're inspiring men. And there's so much you've said that's gold. Thank you very, very, very much. My question is about your mum. My question is, where did that come from in your mum? Because I'm a mum, and the story that stayed with me out of all of those stories the most was the fact that your mum did what she did and the way she did it. Do you know where that came from?
Yeah, first and foremost, my mother's incredible, and I'm very much blessed. I feel like I won the genetic lottery. We all end up with parents that we don't choose, and I feel like I got quite fortunate in terms of that in my life, and it certainly has had a huge impact over time, without a doubt. People ask my mother this question. They say, "You must be so afraid. Your son is out there doing these things that are so inherently risky, where people die, right? Truly life or death stakes." And I have recently lost some friends in a really bad climbing accident in Pakistan. And her response is sort of this coy response as a mother. She smiles and she says, well, of course I worry about him constantly. But she says, but careful what you wish for as a mother. When you whisper in your kid's ear from the day they were born, you can do anything you set your mind to. And obviously the story of the burn accident is a massive turning point in my life. And my mother certainly, like I said, taught me one of life's greatest lessons from the midst of this deep tragedy. But that is a pattern for my mom, right? Like she really cultivated that in an incredible way in that moment for me. But if I trace that back, she also did this in all the smaller incremental moments of my life, all the way throughout my childhood. And I think, again, I call it a possible mindset, but you could call it really anything of just, even when we didn't have so much in our life, resources wise, et cetera, there was still this belief in abundance, an abundance of possibilities, an abundance of options, an abundance of choice to make and create anything that you wanted to dream into reality. And my mother certainly has done that in her own life and has instilled me with that since the day I was born.
if you want to hear a great podcast, Megan Riley sent me a text this morning. She said she was sorry that she couldn't join us, Colin, but she said that her podcast, her Who's Your Mama podcast with your mom, is one of her all-time favorites. So if you guys want to hear Colin's mom, check that out. It's phenomenal.
Thank you so much, Colin.
Tag, we're going to you in Connecticut.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully,
And actually, a question for you, Tag. You weren't the AD at Yale? No,
assistant athletic director. So I started there as an intern and stayed for 8 years as an assistant athletic director in facilities and varsity operations. So we got that little commonality there, Colin.
Nice. What years?
So that was 1990 to 1998.
Gotcha. We just missed each other.
I just missed you. Yeah.
Started there in 2002.
Yep. Yeah. Cool place.
Tom Beckett, was he the AD then?
So when I started, it was Ed Woodson.
Okay.
And then Tom Beckett came in 95, who's a great mentor of mine. Yeah. So no, thanks. We got it between the Yale thing, your dad being an Eagle Scout, the story about your mom resonated because I actually had a conversation with my 21-year-old son in the car last week along the same lines as well. It's really cool. We're so lucky as adults to get to meet people like yourself that are so amazingly, crazily inspirational. My work is with students in grades K through 12. I've been on your website. I see that you speak. I've seen your programming, your nonprofit, and your outreach there, and some of the pictures of you interacting with young people as well, and that whole program as well. So my question today kind of goes to that. What are some things that you do when you're talking about your possible mindset and you're in a group of young people that are underprivileged, don't have access to a lot of things? Are there a couple of things that you could just share just now in this question period, how you kind of address them and what you do to ignite them? And over time, you're still young, but over time, like when we're in education, we're lucky enough, if we're fortunate enough to have a feedback loop where we get to see kids. Like my first student athletes are now 40 years old. Mm-hmm. I'm fortunate enough sometimes to bump into them and get feedback. I'm just curious in your work thus far, if kind of your message, and if you've even gotten some of that feedback loop yet. And later on, I reached out to you on LinkedIn, but I'd love to connect to see what I can do to bring you to my school district.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll definitely, that's a sidebar about that for sure. No, it's amazing. And it's amazing that you've had such a, long career, long enough that you can see that feedback loop of people over time. I mean, it's beautiful. Our work has evolved over the years, of course. And really, it feels like a long time. We started in 2015, but I know in the grand scheme, that's also just a short period of time. But we've, enough that there was kids who were in elementary school or elementary school were getting ready to graduate from high school now, things like that, which is really, really fun to see. I haven't done any sort of like, this is all anecdotal, right? So I haven't done any like longitudinal study, like over time of what has worked and what hasn't worked, et cetera. But one of the things that I have found, when you mentioned sort of like equity, component of this, is one thing that I'm deeply passionate about, and one of the reasons that I'm so excited about the 12-hour walk, not just from the context of, students and education, but just globally, is I found myself speaking, sharing my stories about literally climbing Mount Everest, about walking across Antarctica, et cetera. And people got very excited about that, but then would very quickly get to this place of cool, but like I'm, from an underprivileged neighborhood in wherever, and I'm probably not going to fly to the other side of the world to climb mountains. In fact, I don't even want to climb mountains. Like I'm, like it is a cool story, but like, how does this connect and relate to me? And so a lot of my work over the last few years, both with my expeditions, the 12-hour walk, et cetera, has been to create inroads to that of accessibility. Well, like I said, I sort of stumbled across this 12-hour walk concept, but what I love so much about it is that it really is an invitation for people to be able to do this in sort of any circumstance for the most part, right? The 50 high points that Scott mentioned earlier, again, not something that I necessarily got all the press about, but what was really fun about that project that he didn't mention was on the 50 high points. And this actually started because I was having a conversation with students in Florida, a lower income school district in Florida. I was doing a bunch of work with them and I was talking about my next projects. And they were like, we love this, but there's no mountains in Florida. And like, this is our circumstances. We're not going to necessarily allow for this, at least in this moment in time they're living. And so the 50 high points idea was born. I wanted to set this world record, but I actually did this thing called the Forrest Gump effect, which is I invited any person to come climb any of the mountains with me in their home state. And so in Florida, it's a 350-foot hill on the side of the road, but we had a bunch of teachers and educators and they brought their students out to walk the literal, 40 feet up this hill and touch Florida's highest point. And we had that across the entire United States. So anyways, it's a meandering question. I'd love to talk to you just sort of more about it in the long run. But the point is I've always tried to sort of instill what's the accessible parts of it. And I also say outside of climbing, outside of actually the experiential part of that, the most important muscle any of us has is the 6 inches between our ears. And I fundamentally believe no matter what circumstances we are in, we do have the ability to flex and develop that, even with limited resources, even with limited opportunities in the short run, even at different ages. And so a lot of my work focuses on things that are accessible to everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate that answer.
Brad Mason, you're a cleanup hitter, brother. You're up. You still rocking 45 pounds? Oh, we can't hear you.
Great job.
Brad, bad connection.
I'll have to catch you. Okay, that's fine.
Oh, no.
Gotcha now.
We had you.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Colin, great stuff. I know we don't have a whole lot of time here, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your nonprofit. As Scott said, I started the only interstate obstacle course racing team in the country. So feeding off Keg's comment, our team, no matter how happy you all to give, you get stung by giving. So
yeah, I wish we could get the question in. Sorry about that. Anyway, we're going to have to wrap it up. One of my favorite stories about the 50 summits, Colin, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is I think you set the world record by 20 days and you climbed two mountains that were not the right mountain and had to climb the right mountain.
I got lost a couple times out there and ended up in mountain ranges and get to the top and I'm like, oh shit, that's not the high point. Actual high point's over there. There's a climb back down and come all the way back up.
I love it. And I can't get off the call. So on the 10th, when a lot of people around the world were doing the 12-hour walk, Colin, my badass wife, Meg, was doing Hell on the Hill in Maine and absolutely crushed it. So shout out to Meg, and Lindsay Elizabeth, also in the Outlier Project, was there in Maine with us and absolutely crushed it. So that was very, very fun to see. Colin, man, I know you're a little bit under the weather. I know you got another speech today. I can't thank you enough. This has been an absolute blast.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. And hopefully it inspires you and your guys' group to do the 12-hour walk. I didn't mention it before, but there's obviously the book, but there's a whole website that kind of supports the concept, 12hourwalk.com. Lots of FAQs on there, as well as there's an app that I built that helps to track your walk even while you're in airplane mode and things like that. So there's a whole community and ecosystem built up around that. So it's just a matter of picking your day, putting it on your calendar and making it happen. So I'd love to stay in touch with you, Scott, and your community as that all unfolds for sure.
Awesome. Kathy, take us out.
This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made. This is how legends are made.
Colin, thanks for inspiring us. Best of luck today, and we will talk again soon. I think we lost him. Anyone want to stay on a little overtime?